Indian soldiers scream at the top of their lungs for the approaching Chinese forces to halt. The air is thin and crisp atop the peaks of the Himalayas. Both sides are armed with machine guns, but no one raises their weapons in fear that if any shots are fired, it could lead to all-out war. An Indian soldier lashes out with a long stick and strikes a Chinese man across the face. All is silent as the Chinese soldier stumbles back in shock. He places his hand on his cheek, looks across the line of actual control, and orders his troops to attack. A brawl breaks out. This scenario occurred near the small Himalayan town of Tawang in the Arunachal Pradesh region of India. The aggression is the result of 60 years of disagreement over the borders in the region. The line of actual control separates Arunachal Pradesh from Tibet, which the Chinese government sees as its territory. However, since the line was first drawn by the British during their colonization of India, this boundary has shifted, been fought over, and almost led to a war a number of times. The bloodiest battle over the region started on October 23, 1962. It's the early morning. The sun has just started to peek its head over the tops of the Himalayas. The mist rises from the high-altitude grasses as Indian soldiers prepare to change shifts. Suddenly, the far-off sound of artillery fire echoes off the cliff face. The Indian soldiers dive into their trenches and shells rain down from the sky. They peer over the top of the dirt to sight the enemy as the dust settles. They have orders to protect the border but are hesitant to launch their own offensive until Central Command gives the order. As the dust settles, shouting can be heard from across the line of actual control. A contingent of Chinese soldiers runs toward the entrenched Indian forces with their guns raised. Shots ring out as the Indian border guards open fire on the incoming Chinese forces. Bullets rip through flesh. Bayonets slice into the enemy. The butts of guns slam into faces. It's chaos. The Indian soldiers are overrun. 17 men are dead and another 13 were captured by the Chinese invasion force. The remaining Indian soldiers fall back to the nearby Buddhist monastery at Tawang. The following day, the Chinese appear at the gates of the monastery. They outnumber the Indian force and are better equipped. The peace and tranquility of the monastery is shattered as Chinese troops force their way in and capture the temple. From Tawang, the Chinese forces march further south. They claim village after village. It seems as if nothing can stop them. This could be the beginning of a Chinese occupation of India. Small skirmishes break out across the region. Indian soldiers try to mount a resistance, but the mountains make this area incredibly hard to get to. There's no telling when reinforcements will arrive. The Chinese soldiers continue to march south toward Assam, one of the region's wealthiest and most important settlements. It's here that there are vibrant tea gardens, rich oil fields, and jute plantations used to produce cord. India is in big trouble. It seems they're about to lose an entire region of the country to their adversaries. Then, just under a month after Chinese forces cross the line of actual control, they begin to retreat back to their side of the border. On November 21, 1962, the Chinese declare a ceasefire, and the war to control the Himalayas comes to a swift end. All indications pointed to the Chinese being successful in occupying Arunachal Pradesh. They had taken numerous mountain villages and towns. The Indian military couldn't believe the Chinese had just given up, for no apparent reason. 1,383 Indian soldiers were killed in the brief war. Around 1,700 went missing in the treacherous landscape of the Himalayan mountains. Chinese records indicate that their forces killed 4,900 Indian soldiers and citizens and captured another 3,968. However, actual numbers are likely somewhere between the two nations' reports. To this day, no one except for the Chinese government knows why their troops were recalled. Maybe they had other plans, or perhaps the Chinese military thought they had overextended themselves and couldn't resupply their troops. Yet, even though the Chinese could have taken the Arunachal Pradesh region off of India in 1962, they didn't, which seems odd as there would be continued fighting along the border for decades to come. Fast forward to 1987. Indian officials make Arunachal Pradesh a state. The Chinese government is furious over the official status change of the region. Until that point, both sides claimed the territory for themselves, but no official change in the region's status had occurred. Now that it was official, India flooded the region with new defenses and infrastructure. Even with India officially incorporating the region into its borders as a state, fights continue to break out along the border with China. Arunachal Pradesh might have been part of India, but the exact location of the border running through the Himalayas between it and Tibet was still unclear. In 2008, when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh visited Arunachal Pradesh, China threw a hissy fit. Singh announced that India would embark on a series of road-building projects to better connect the region to the rest of the country. Even with most nations around the world recognizing Arunachal Pradesh as part of India, China still calls the region South Tibet and has renamed several towns on the Indian side of the border, saying that they rightfully belong to China. Tensions continued to rise throughout the 2000s, and in 2020, violence broke out along the border once again. The current problem and the problems of the past are due to the fact that a colonizing power established the line of actual control without much thought or any real plan of how the border would be enforced in the future. Ever since it was established in 1959 by the British, there's been fighting over who controls the region. However, there is something else happening, and it's the fault of almost every nation on the planet. The world is changing, and it's not just because of geopolitical turmoil. The environment and landscape of the Himalayas and the rest of the world have been altered by climate change. However, in regions with extreme ecosystems such as the high Himalayas, the environment is changing more rapidly than the rest of the world. The snowpacks and glaciers are melting, revealing new landscapes. As the climate shifts, so does the environment, and what were once natural boundaries along the line of actual control, such as rivers, lakes, and snowcaps. This obviously complicates things even further, as the border becomes fluid, and there's no definitive boundary that India and China can agree on. Because of this new uncertainty, the area has become more and more dangerous for civilians and soldiers alike. In June of 2020, a vicious battle broke out in the Galwan Valley of the Ladakh region, where 20 Indian soldiers and at least 4 Chinese died. A contingent of Chinese troops wades through the river running between the Galwan Valley. Word has reached Indian forces that the Chinese are on the move. It's an uncertain situation as the valley has changed slightly over the years, but the Indians are adamant that this part of Ladakh is under their control. An Indian force moves in to intercept the advancing Chinese. They hope that a conflict can be avoided, so rather than fully arming themselves, the Indian soldiers carry clubs with nails in them, sturdy sticks, and rocks to fight back the Chinese troops. The Indian soldiers round a bend in the river. A group of dozens of Chinese soldiers is coming toward them. Their commanding officer advances to discuss the situation with one of the Chinese captains. They meet in the middle of the stream. The Indian officer asks what's going on and tells the Chinese commander to halt his troops. He doesn't listen. The Chinese soldier shoves the Indian officer, pushing him backward. The two sides begin shouting at one another. It's not clear who throws the first punch or lashes out with the first stick, but fighting erupts. The Indian soldiers charge forward with their nail-studded clubs. The Chinese forces use riot gear to protect themselves against the deadly attack. Blood spills into the river, turning its waters red. Chinese soldiers at the front of the pack are bludgeoned to death, even as they use their own clubs and knives to rip through the ranks of Indian soldiers. In the chaos, a young Chinese fighter falls into the icy water. He's dragged under by his heavy gear and drowns. The soldiers pull back from one another, collecting their wounded as they retreat. Neither side is victorious. The Chinese proceed back toward their territory and the Indians regroup. Later, the governments will give the dead soldiers posthumous awards, and tensions will continue to rise in the region. After close to 45 years of relative stability along the contested border, blood has been shed once again. And in only a couple of years' time, the two countries may be on the brink of war once again. In January 2021, another rumble broke out between the Chinese and Indian troops. Once again, it was over a disagreement about where the border actually is. But this time, the dispute was in India's Sikkim state, which sits between Bhutan and Nepal. The dispute was relatively calm compared to the bloody battle that had occurred several months before. Both sides agreed to disengage from the region and return to their respective sides. However, as 2022 came to a close, Chinese troop numbers started to grow near the region of Arunachal Pradesh once again. This wasn't just a redeployment of soldiers, it seemed to be a mass mobilization. The increase in troops was preceded by a massive road-building project in the Chinese-controlled region of Tibet. It was becoming clear that the network of roads being constructed was a way for the Chinese military to move troops throughout the region more easily. Every week, more and more Chinese soldiers arrived near the line of actual control. Winter in the Himalayas was just beginning when the conflict started to brew. Outside of Tawang and the Buddhist temple that had once been captured by Chinese forces in 1962, Indian soldiers prepare themselves for battle. Reports are coming in that the Chinese troops are encroaching on the line of actual control. There is uneasiness across the world as the war in Russia continues to rage. Peace on planet Earth seems to be an all but forgotten concept by now. Indian forces are unsure what the Chinese soldiers are planning to do, but with Russia invading its neighbor, China might have ambitions of its own. Indian soldiers mobilize across the region. December 9th is a chilly day. The Indian soldiers can see their breath rising into the heavens as they wait for the approaching enemy. They dig in at a small village called Yangtze. Of course, the Chinese claim this village is part of their territory. The line dividing their two sides is so ambiguous that many of the villages in the region have two names, one given to them by India and another by the Chinese government. The battle at Galwan Valley is still fresh in everyone's minds. Indian troops are prepared for anything this time, which means when the Chinese soldiers are spotted, they do not wait for diplomatic intervention. Instead, India gets ready for battle. Since the bloody conflict a couple of years back, The Indian military has implemented new tactics. Now when the Chinese forces become aggressive, there's a second layer of troops ready to deploy to the border to aid those who are on patrol. This is known as a quick reaction team, and they've already arrived in Tawang. The Chinese are within striking distance. Both sides begin to shout at one another. Once again, sticks and clubs are drawn to engage in hand-to-hand combat. The Indian troops charge the Chinese soldiers walking toward them. They're not prepared for this. In the initial panic, several soldiers are injured as sticks crack against bodies and clubs thud into armor. The Chinese force immediately disengages and retreats back across the border. Immediately after the retreat, a Chinese commander approaches the border with a sign of peace. An Indian officer goes to meet him. They discuss the disagreement at length and decide to stand down and restore peace and tranquility to the area. When the Indian parliament addresses the conflict, they conclude that China's actions were an encroachment on their territory to change the status quo in the region. It's not enough to launch a war, but it's enough to bring in another major player to keep an eye on the conflict: the United States. China responds by claiming that India has been building too much infrastructure along the border and that some projects are crossing into Chinese territory. Beijing is under the delusion that Indian soldiers are constantly trespassing and infringing on China's domain. And while it's true that India is upgrading the infrastructure along the border, it's only doing so to connect the region of the country to other major infrastructure around it. The Chinese and Indian governments agree to disagree. The exact location of the border and who controls which pieces of land are still in dispute. The scary thing is that if one side becomes too aggressive, it could lead to a war between the two nations. And since both have large armies, powerful vehicles, and nuclear capabilities, a war between China and India could throw the entire region into chaos. So the question becomes, why has China been so aggressive in the region lately? For decades, there seemed to be relative peace, and the landscape of the Himalayas can be incredibly harsh and inhospitable. What has driven Chinese forces to test their luck against the Indian military? Some analysts believe it has to do with a location called Aksai Chin. This region is known for its ice desert, which is rich in minerals. China might hope that India will formally give them control of the area, and in return they could accept Arunachal Pradesh as belonging solely to India. This would result in less conflict in these two areas, but as of right now, it seems that neither side is willing to make the concession. Another theory is that China is keeping the border conflict alive for its own sinister plans. China might not even care about the contested regions in the Himalayas. Instead, they want the Indian military to devote resources and men there, which will allow China to become more dominant in other parts of Asia. The more attention India gives to the Arunachal Pradesh region, the less infrastructure and expansion they'll carry out in other parts of the country. China might hope that this will dial back India's ambitions. They may also expect that if there is an ongoing conflict in India, the United States may be more hesitant to strengthen ties with the country out of uncertainty for the future. However, if this was China's plan, it does not seem to be working. After hostilities broke out in December 2022, the United States reacted by doubling down its support for India. The Biden administration offered to send advanced military equipment and resources, citing China's actions as being provocative. The U.S. also said it would ramp up its intelligence sharing with India as well, which it had done previously during prior conflicts. So if China's plan was to deter U.S. involvement in the region, it certainly backfired. China likely sees India as its biggest rival in Asia. Both countries have similar-sized populations, although Chinese manufacturing capabilities are currently much more advanced than India's. Investments by U.S. companies and other national corporations might allow India to become a major tech manufacturing hub in the coming years. India also has a formidable navy, and with the aid of the United States could grow its ground strength considerably. It's also no secret that the United States and India have close ties in several business sectors that could help both nations gain more power and influence in Asian markets. The closer the US and India become, the worse things will get for China. And the Chinese government knows this, so they might be provoking India to see how the US will react. Unfortunately for China, it didn't go as they hoped. Then again, maybe the most recent Chinese incursions into Indian territory were a way for them to voice their displeasure. The timing of the incident occurred 1 month after Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi met at the G20 summit in Bali. This was also only 1 week after the US-India military exercise called Yudh Abhyas 2022, a war simulation and preparation exercise that was almost certainly based around a larger conflict with China. Part of this war exercise occurred in the high altitudes of India's Uttarakhand state, which is not only on the Chinese border but also contains similar terrain to the territory that is disputed, around the line of actual control. Perhaps China might have been showing India and the US that it too could conduct military exercises in the mountains of the Himalayas, or perhaps China was just showing their displeasure about war exercises happening so close to their borders. It's hard to say what the exact reason for the Chinese military overstep in the Arunachal Pradesh region was, since the government hasn't made any type of clear statement about the incident other than it was protecting its borders. Less likely, but also a possibility for why Chinese troops crossed the border, is that they might have been probing Indian defenses. Maybe they're curious if their forces could just march into the Arunachal Pradesh and seize the region as they did back in 1962. Clearly, this is no longer the case, and the backlash from the US in the form of ramping up their intelligence sharing and military aid to India is a clear indication that any invasion would be met with a swift repercussion. A more likely reason for the probing into Indian territory has to do with the distraction tactic. Again, if India is focused on the land borders of the Himalayas, it might spend less time and resources on its maritime capabilities. China might have been trying to point out that India's borders to the north are still vulnerable in the hopes that they'd send more troops and invest more money into that region of the country. China might not be interested in Arunachal Pradesh at all, but most certainly cares about controlling the waters off the coast of Asia. The waterways connecting the Pacific and Indian Oceans are incredibly important for trade. China likely doesn't want anyone contesting its cargo ships or naval vessels from freely moving about the seas, and right now the only country in the region that could even come remotely close to matching their maritime capabilities is India. There's very little chance that China is planning a war with India. There's an even smaller chance that they will invade from Tibet and proceed through the difficult terrain of the Himalayas. Therefore, the skirmishes that have broken out along the border of Arunachal Pradesh are most likely just the Chinese government's way of voicing its displeasure. Then again, it could just be the complete incompetence of Chinese forces stationed in the region that has led to this conflict. Maybe they really don't know where the border is. This is probably not the last brawl containing sticks and clubs that'll break out along the ambiguous line of actual control. Luckily, these skirmishes also likely won't ignite a full-blown war between the two nuclear powers either. Now watch India versus China. Who would win? Army-military comparison. Or check out China's plan to take over the world.